The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon in Largo, Florida. It was the kind of evening that felt uneventful. Warm air, porch lights flickering on, and the hum of lawn sprinklers marking time. At the end of the cul-de-sac, Karen Gregory's modest home stood like any other. Shutters neat, garden trimmed, the American flag on her porch catching the last gold streaks of sunlight. Inside, Karen, a beloved 61-year-old landlord known for her kindness, was preparing to wind down for the night. She had no idea that her life was about to shatter in a way no one could imagine. He was someone she trusted, someone she had helped. Her tenant, a familiar face. But that evening, that face brought with it something unspeakable. The attack that followed wouldn't just ruin a home. It would traumatize a neighborhood, send shockwaves through the state, and trigger one of the most terrifying criminal rampages Largo had ever seen.
Welcome to Crime Bite.
In this channel, we peel back the layers of those hidden realities. Raw evidence, conflicting testimonies, and emotional pleas for help that too often come too late. By looking into these crime bites, you'll see firsthand how broken trust, systemic oversights, and chilling motives can converge into stories that rattle us to the core. If you find this exploration as vital as we do, be sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the notifications button. Together, we can shine a light on the cases that demand attention, ensuring every voice, especially the silenced, finds the audience it deserves. The night of June 24th, 2025 started like any other in Port Charlotte, Florida. It was hot, sticky, and calm. Just another sweltering evening in a sleepy Gulf Coast town where trouble rarely knocked loudly. But that night, trouble didn't knock. It walked straight up to 59-year-old Kelly Jo Beard's front door, wearing a face she had come to trust. Brian Thomas Leach, 37, wasn't a stranger. In fact, he was her tenant. She had rented to him, spoken with him, even helped him through rough patches. Kelly was the kind of landlord who still believed in giving people chances. She kept rent affordable, checked in when tenants seemed down, and waved to neighbors like she meant it. A former nurse, now retired, she had a soft spot for the struggling, but kindness can be a dangerous currency. On that muggy night, Brian arrived not as a grateful tenant, but as something else entirely. Neighbors later said they heard raised voices, then a chilling silence, then screams. What followed would be a brutal act of violence and a chain of events that left a community shaken to its core. And for Kelly, it would be a night she wouldn't walk away from. What causes a man to turn on someone who once gave him shelter? And how could no one see it coming? In the days leading up to the attack, Brian Thomas Leach had been spiraling. Friends, what few he had left, described him as increasingly paranoid. He believed people were out to get him. He mumbled about cameras watching his every move, even in his sleep. There was a disturbing undercurrent in every conversation, a barely concealed rage, but nobody thought he'd hurt anyone. He was just weird Brian, the guy who never quite fit in. The one who'd been evicted more than once, who always had a story and a shaky excuse. But in his mind, a narrative was building, one where Kelly was the villain. She had started asking him about rent again. She had mentioned maybe having to evict him if things didn't get better. It wasn't personal, but to Brian it felt like betrayal. And betrayal, he decided, needed punishment. He began stalking her movements, not in a cinematic way, but in the quiet, terrifying realness of someone watching from behind a cracked blind. He noted when she left the house, when she returned. He knew her dog barked at strangers but wagged its tail at him. He used that trust. He also started borrowing a car, an old Nissan Altima, from an acquaintance who had no idea what he planned to do with it. He rehearsed. In his twisted logic, he believed he was teaching a lesson. The plan was ready. All he needed was a reason to get close. How many warning signs do we ignore when danger doesn't look like a stranger? Don't forget to like, share your opinions in the comment section, and click the notification button to subscribe for more amazing content as we journey through to the end. It wasn't unusual to see Brian Thomas Leach around the neighborhood. He wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was Karen Gregory's tenant, a man who had shared civil conversations, accepted packages on her behalf, and occasionally borrowed tools from the shed behind the house. In many ways, he had become a familiar face. But on this day, the familiarity would morph into something sinister. As Brian approached the front door of Karen's single-story Florida home, something was clearly off. His steps were uneven. His shoulders twitched. He wore a dark hoodie despite the muggy summer air. And while neighbors had seen him casually greet Karen before, this time there was no knock, just silence. Then, entry. Karen had let her guard down. It's easy to do when the person at your door doesn't look like a threat. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't yell or break anything. He simply walked in, uninvited, unannounced, and unnoticed. But what happened after that changed everything. Neighbors later described strange behavior in the hours leading up to the attack. Brian had been seen pacing in front of the house earlier that morning, muttering under his breath. One elderly resident remembered seeing him stare blankly into space before suddenly laughing. Another had watched him circle the block more than once, glancing toward Karen's house with unsettling focus. Inside, Karen may have greeted him with confusion or concern. She was known to be kind, the type of person who might have asked, "Are you okay?" before realizing the danger. Then came the shouting. A few neighbors heard it, short bursts, a woman's voice raised in panic, a man yelling, something about "you said you would help," something else about "you took everything from me." And then, nothing, just dead air. One neighbor considered calling 911, but hesitated. They told reporters later, "It stopped so suddenly. I thought maybe it was just a bad argument." But this wasn't an argument, it was the quiet before the storm. When someone you trust suddenly crosses the line, how do you recognize the moment before it's too late? By the time Karen realized Brian wasn't just there to talk, it was already too late. What began as a tense exchange in the living room exploded into an eruption of violence. Police believe Brian snapped, driven by rage, delusion, or both. He allegedly lunged at Karen without warning, knocking her into a side table and sending the flower vase crashing to the ground. From that moment, the assault escalated into something animalistic. Karen tried to fight back. Scratches on Brian's arms, later documented by authorities, suggested a struggle, but she was no match for the strength and fury that met her. He struck her again and again, first with fists, then with nearby objects, a heavy photo frame, a floor lamp, anything he could lift. The living room became a war zone. Neighbors would later describe hearing screams, raw and terrified, before the sounds were muffled by what one called a loud slam, like furniture tipping over. One resident, still shaking during their interview, whispered, "I thought someone was being murdered." Turns out, someone was. When first responders arrived, they found Karen barely conscious on the ground, her face swollen, her arms bruised, and blood trickling from a wound above her eye. She had been beaten, possibly with multiple objects. Yet the worst hadn't even happened yet. While medics worked to stabilize her, another sound echoed in the distance, an engine. Karen's own car. Brian had taken her car keys, but he wasn't fleeing the scene. He wasn't running from justice. He was preparing for the next act. Like something from a nightmare, Brian gunned the engine and aimed directly at Karen's house. He didn't hesitate, he didn't brake. He drove the car through the front wall of the home, glass shattered, wood splintered. The entire front facade of Karen's home collapsed inward as the vehicle exploded into the living room, stopping only after it hit the back wall. Fire crews rushed to the scene, fearing that the crash would ignite a blaze. Police pulled Karen from the rubble, battered but still alive. Somehow she had survived both the beating and the crash. Brian Leach was arrested on site, expressionless, soaked in sweat, muttering something about revenge, and they never listened. Like, share your opinions in the comment section, and click the notification button to subscribe for more amazing content as we journey through to the end. What do you think causes someone to not just want to destroy a person, but their home, their safety, and every corner of the world they trusted? There was no warning, no sirens, no tire screech to alert the quiet suburban street of what was coming. Just the roar of an engine. In an act that stunned even the most seasoned first responders, Brian Leach weaponized something meant for travel and turned it into a battering ram. At nearly 70 miles per hour, he accelerated through Karen Gregory's peaceful cul-de-sac and aimed straight for her home. Witnesses described the sound as something from a war zone. One said it felt like the world cracked open. Another, a mother tending to her garden across the street, recounted watching in horror as the silver car launched forward like a missile. The collision wasn't subtle, it was an obliteration. The front of Karen's house collapsed like a house of cards. Bricks exploded into the yard, windows shattered. A porch beam impaled the ground like a javelin. A front door flew across the living room and embedded into the drywall on the other side. Karen's neighbors initially thought it was an earthquake. Or worse. "I thought a plane had hit the block," said Mr. Doyle, the elderly man next door. "I was knocked right out of my recliner, and I've lived through tornadoes. But this felt personal." Inside the wreckage, Karen was miraculously still alive, though bruised, bloodied, and barely conscious. First responders pulled her from the rubble with torn clothing, glass in her hair, and the stunned expression of someone who had just witnessed her sanctuary turn into a battleground. As fire crews extinguished the engine smoke and stabilized the debris, the gravity of the moment became clear. The house was now a crime scene twice over, once for the brutal beating, now for the deliberate, destructive crash. And just when authorities thought the nightmare had climaxed, they discovered Brian Leach was no longer at the scene. He had vanished. When someone turns your home into a weapon, where can you ever feel safe again? Brian Leach may have fled the scene, but law enforcement refused to let him slip away quietly. Within minutes of the crash, a multi-county manhunt erupted. The Florida heat was suffocating, but the urgency was hotter. He was now not only the suspect in a vicious assault, but also the alleged perpetrator of a vehicular attack, one that could have easily killed his victim and anyone else inside. Police feared he could be armed, desperate, unhinged. Roadblocks were established at every major artery. Residents were told to lock their doors, stay inside, and report anything unusual. Schools in a 5-mile radius went into lockdown. Panic rippled through the community. Tips began pouring in. "I saw a guy limping near the highway exit. He tried to steal clothes off a line in my backyard. There's a barefoot man hiding behind the dumpster at the gas station." Officers followed every lead, but Leach was slippery. The terrain worked in his favor. Florida brushland, abandoned sheds, swampy ditches. He knew the area, and he knew how to hide. For 48 hours, the town held its breath. Was he still nearby? Was he watching? Then the breakthrough came. A retired couple in a quiet neighborhood reported hearing movement behind their shed at dawn. When officers arrived, they crept around the back, weapons drawn, expecting the worst. What they found was both shocking and pitiful. Brian Leach, once a looming threat of uncontrollable violence, was now curled under an overturned canoe. He was barefoot, sunburnt, bleeding from multiple cuts, and whispering to himself. He didn't resist. He didn't cry. He simply held out his hands to be cuffed. Officers later said the arrest was unsettling in its calmness. It was like he'd spent all his rage, one officer recalled. Like he had burned down the world, and now there was nothing left in him but ashes. The town could breathe again, but the damage was irreversible. Karen Gregory's life had been forever shattered, her home destroyed, her sense of peace annihilated. And as Brian sat in the back of that patrol car, staring blankly through the glass, the community asked, "When the monster is finally caught, what's left of the person they used to be?" Don't forget to like, share your opinions in the comments section, and click the notification button to subscribe for more amazing content as we journey through to the end. During the trial, prosecutors painted Brian Leach as cold, calculating, and vengeful. His past was laid bare. Prior arrests for domestic disputes, restraining orders, mental health evaluations ignored or never completed. Karen's testimony was the most powerful moment in court. Bandaged, shaken, but determined, she recounted every detail. The betrayal, the terror, the near-death experience. Her words moved the courtroom to silence, and even the defense attorney paused before proceeding with cross-examination. Leach's legal team tried to argue diminished capacity. They said he had a mental breakdown, that he needed help, not prison. But the jury didn't buy it. He was found guilty on all counts: attempted murder, aggravated battery, destruction of property, and unauthorized use of a vehicle. When a victim survives, do they ever truly get to live freely again? Karen's home was reduced to rubble, but her life, the one she fought so hard to keep, was still hers. She moved away from the neighborhood shortly after the trial. Too many ghosts, too many memories. She started therapy. Community groups rallied around her. Local news turned her into a symbol of survival. But behind the headlines was a woman still piecing her life back together. Insurance barely covered the damage. Emotional trauma stretched deeper than dollars could reach. And yet she endured, because surviving wasn't a gift, It was a fight. What does healing look like when your world was crushed by someone you trusted? Karen's case prompted legal action, not just criminal, but civil. She sued Brian Leach for damages, but more importantly, she began pushing for reforms in tenant screening, mental health access, and protection for landlords living on site. The town held public safety forums. New ordinances were introduced. Advocacy groups cited Karen's story in campaigns for better victim protections. Her personal pain was now public policy, a blueprint for how towns can respond when the unthinkable happens. Can one woman's nightmare spark change that protects thousands? Karen Gregory never asked to be a survivor. She wanted to be a good landlord, a quiet neighbor, a kind woman living her life in peace. But in surviving Brian Leach's brutal attack, she became more than a victim. She became a warning, a voice, a symbol. Her story is not just about violence. It's about justice, resilience, and reclaiming power. And Brian Leach, he's serving a life sentence. But the scars he left behind will take longer than any sentence to fade. What would you do if the danger was already inside your home? Karen Gregory survived the attack, but the scars are permanent, emotional, physical, architectural. The home she nurtured for decades is now a shell of its former self. The front porch where she once drank coffee and waved to neighbors is gone. So is her sense of safety. Brian Leach now sits behind bars facing a mountain of charges: attempted murder, grand theft auto, burglary with assault, and criminal mischief, among others. But justice doesn't always bring closure. Karen's neighbors speak in hushed tones now, lock their doors more religiously, and every time an engine revs too loudly, they flinch, remembering the night the street became a war zone. In a world where monsters often wear familiar faces, and safe places turn dangerous in a heartbeat, one question still haunts this Florida town. How do you rebuild when your home and your trust has been reduced to rubble? Don't forget to like, share your opinions in the comment section, and click the notification button to subscribe for more amazing content.